Hello and welcome to episode 44 of Pushing Cardboard. I'm Grant Lindenberg, and this episode, no interview, but we'll be looking at a game or two, or maybe even three. We'll also have news and chatter about the board, wargaming hobby, all the things you're used to. As always, this episode is sponsored by Noble Knight Games. If there's an out-of-print game you're looking for, they're your best chance. If you're looking for used games to avoid the new in-shrink price, they've got thousands. And if you're looking to sell games, they're your best choice as well. Check out the link in the show notes or the newsletter or on the website and use it to get to their store. That way they'll know I sent you. I'll get a little kickback, I'll spend it on games, I'll tell you about them, and then you'll head back to buy more games. It's a virtuous circle. News. Live Cardboard number 6 was a live roundtable on how the tariffs are impacting our hobby. Joining me were Richard Handwith and Roger Miller from Revolution Games and David Heath from Lock and Load. We managed to steer more or less clear of the politics of why the tariffs are in place and instead focused on how they impact the publishers and how they intend to move forward in the current situation. Lots of questions from the live viewers. Judging from the response after the fact, there was plenty of good information from the publishers. The most common comment was, "Wow, I didn't realize there was so much to it." Like all the live shows, it's available on the YouTube channel. And as with most things mentioned this episode, there will be links in the newsletter as well as in the show notes for the podcast and on the website. I had invited Gene Billingsley from GMT to be part of the roundtable, but he declined as he was still working on his response to the tariffs and wanted to present it as a coherent whole rather than just sharing where he was at when I contacted him. That response is now out in the form of the monthly GMT Newsletter. There's a ton to digest there. He discusses many of the things we discussed live, including the one so many think is the easy solution, just print in the USA. He puts paid to that idea, at least in the short term. However, he does say they are actively searching for printing options outside of China. I've heard that Poland might be a good option. Gene points out that the biggest problem they face is cash flow. P500 charges would generally pay for the games to be manufactured and sent back to the States. With the tariffs, after paying the printers for the manufacturing, when the product returns home, they then owe the federal government a fee that's 1.45 times larger than what they already paid for the manufacturing. And then, in his example, they currently owe the printer $500,000. When they've shipped it home, they will then owe the government another $700,000. Obviously, there's no way to continue with this model moving forward. Gene also points out that they're suffering from worldwide anger at the U.S. tariffs that are spurring on boycotts of U.S. goods. He makes a plea for international customers to not abandon GMT at this difficult time. To that end, they are looking for ways to fulfill international orders without bringing the product home to the USA first. If they manage to work that out, all that product won't be subject to tariffs, but it's a big lift and it may still cost more than what we're used to. As cash flow is their largest problem, they have $500,000 worth of inventory waiting in China to be shipped. They've announced a loyalty sale. The best way to support them and help them through this is to buy their games, obviously. So he's put almost everything on sale again for 25% off. Just put GMT25 in the discount code box when checking out, and you'll trigger the discounts. He outlines a few other things, including a small tariff surcharge for stuff that does come into the States, as well as the aforementioned plan to handle international orders completely outside of the US. The other plans are to do smaller print runs to minimize the inventory beyond the P500 amounts and to slow the pace of production while they get the rest of their plans in place. If you want to read the specifics on how the largest wargame publisher is approaching the tariff situation, it's an interesting read. On the plus side, the newsletter did have the usual news of what's coming from GMT. Rebel Fury is now on Steam, and Vijayanagar is now on Rally the Troops. There are enough problems with the counters for Battle of Normandy Deluxe Edition that they're making a free replacement set available. And on the new on P500 list, Draken. It's Volko Ruhnke's next game using the same system as his Coast Watchers game. This time the setting is the First World War. Coast Watchers features some completely new mechanics, and Draken will feature these as well. It's an insta-buy for me. Okay, enough about GMT. Many of you will recognize the name Mike Nagel. As well as being the designer of games like Flying Colors, he was also a real force in the upfront community, including putting out a newsletter and a website called Relative Range. Mike has repurposed that name and is now self-publishing his new games, using Blue Panther as the printer. He has 2 games ready for pre-order, one on an Ancients Battles and one on World War II Tactical. Back to the tariffs briefly. MMP has announced they are reversing their plan to print in China. The tariff situation hit them just as they were moving their printing to China to reduce the price of their games. That plan is on hold while they figure out what to do. And finally, in pushing cardboard news, we've revamped our polls section. There are polls available to the public at large, as well as polls that only show up for registered users or supporters. The old polling software hadn't been updated in a few years, so we changed it for something new and relaunched a bunch of polls. Check them out. It's a fun way to spend a little time thinking about war games. New games to the collection. Not a big list this time. The first 3 I got from Revolution. They're all by designer Stefan Ekstrom, who publishes now, I think, with his own company called 3 Crowns. Anyway, Revolution had 3 of his games from previous that I didn't own. Across the Narva, the Soviet assault on Estonia. Königsberg, the Soviet attack on East Prussia. And Poland Defiant, the German invasion. All 3 of these are they're chit pull games. They're similar to what I've played with his games from 3 Crowns, and so I ordered them all up because I thought, I love these games. Here's some more by the same designer. I'll give them a go. The next one, Solomon's Campaign, which I'll be talking about later, is this is a game from World at War magazine, I think it's called. Anyway, the designer just wrote me and said, "Hey, I just published my first game. Would you check it out?" And so I did, and we'll talk about it today. And then finally, I also got a Kickstarter came in, Verdun, just the simple name Verdun, which was going to make it a little tricky looking it up on BGG, I suppose. But anyway, it's a card game. The publisher's out of Finland, and I'll talk about that one later as well. The Solomon's Campaign, 1942-43. This is a rarity for me. I'm taking a look at a new solitaire game. The designer, Alan Vanoy, wrote to me to see if I'd be interested and then sent a copy. Normally I might pass on a solitaire game, but I've been playing so much World War II Pacific Theater stuff the last while I decided to check it out. The game has been published in the latest issue of World of War magazine, number 101. So right away you're knowing we're dealing with something of a reasonable size. The rulebook's just 16 pages. And I'll note, as I haven't spoken about World at War magazine before, the way they insert their rules in their magazines is excellent. Glued in with an easily removable glue. No staples to bend or anything like that. Totally terrific. The game is operational level with month-long turns. The map is a standard 22 by 34. Rather than hexes, it's divided into squares. It works great. At this scale, we're not looking at maneuvers, but rather simple distances. At the one end of the map, we have the Japanese-held Rabaul and the Truk Air Base. At the other, the American Espirito Santo Base and Guadalcanal. It's divided into a grid of 12 by 6 with Truk and Espiritu Santo just off-map as holding boxes. You play as the American. Your objective is to gain pretty much total control of the area. If you manage to take Rabaul, you win immediately. But failing that, there are victory points for controlling all the other bases. Tulagi, Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville, etc. As well as points won and lost for sinking Japanese ships or losing American ones. You have 15 months to get the job done. Each side starts with little on the map, but brings on replacements, or reinforcements, I should say, on the 1st, 6th, and 11th turns. The counters represent carriers, battleships, cruiser and destroyer squadrons, as well as subs and transport ships. The ground units are battalions and regiments, basic infantry or engineers for constructing bases, and then there's a wide variety of aircraft types with varying anti-air, anti-ground, anti-sub, and anti-naval factors. Finally, each side has an assortment of random event chits. Some of these are used once and then discarded, some are used and then put back in the draw cup. For the Japanese, they can be as simple as placing an infantry or engineer unit on a random location, or as huge as launching fully half its ships from Truk versus wherever the Americans' northernmost ships are. So, let's run through the sequence of play and see how it all works. On any of the turns with reinforcements, they get to put each side's reinforcements in the reinforcement box at the top of the turn. The Japanese units will be assigned to different locations on the map or in off-map boxes right away, all done randomly dependent on unit type. But your US units will remain in your reinforcement box until you spend resources to get them out. And then it's the US turn. It's pretty straightforward. You draw a random event. It may let you do something immediately or hold on to the chit for future use. Common chits are for free amphibious invasions or for modifiers to initiative or combat rolls. And then it's your action phase. Each turn, the US player gets one action plus more for holding certain key bases. So as you make progress, you'll get more and more actions per turn. You also get an extra action on each of the first turns to get you started. There's many different actions to choose from. Here's a few of the key ones. Roll a die and randomly pull that many unit counters from your reinforcement box to deploy. Scout Japanese units in a location. The Japanese ground units are set out flipped over so you don't know their strength. You can move a force of naval units from Espiritu Santo onto the map. You can move a naval force from an onboard location to an enemy location to initiate a naval battle. You can move a force of air units to initiate an air attack, or launch an amphibious invasion using combined air, naval, and ground units. You can rebase a naval or air force. You can build a base, or you can refit some units. This is the way the US player gets some of its units back. There are other actions, but those give you an idea of what you can do. To do a big attack that includes carriers, you'll need a couple of actions. First one to move your carriers within range, but not to the actual target square, and then a second to move your naval force into the target location. Combat. Well, we might as well take a look at that right now. A lot depends on who manages to get the first strike, and it's very random. A simple 1d6 roll for each side where the defender wins ties. There's a couple of dice roll modifiers possible, but not many. And then it's on to the actual combat. There's 4 stages. Whoever gets to fire first fires first in each stage, and the other side has to take losses before firing back. So the first side does all its anti-air, then the second side does its anti-air, then the first side does its surface naval combat, followed by the second side. Same routine for anti-subs, and then finally for ground units if there's any left. The combat itself is very simple. Each unit will have ratings versus air, naval, sub, and ground. They range between 0, meaning that they can't target that type of target, to 4. You roll a die, and if you roll less than or equal to the rating, you hit. Carriers and battleships are 2-step units. Everything else is a single step. Hit units go into their side's refit box where they may come back into play or may be eliminated entirely. It's worth noting that each combat is just a single round. If both sides still have units remaining, they stay in that square together, at least for a while. This is important as the other multi-step unit in the game is bases, which can have up to 4 steps, so it can take ground units a few turns to capture a base. Most of the American actions are something you do alone as the American player, other than rolling for the Japanese half of any combat. But there are a couple common situations where the Japanese will respond during the American turn. If the American does a ground attack as one of their actions and units on both sides remain, the Japanese will do an immediate counterattack. Pretty simple. But more interesting, whenever the American does an amphibious invasion, the Japanese rolls on a table for response. They may respond with a ground attack, an air attack, a naval attack, or a combined air and naval attack. So you don't know what you face when you do an amphibious assault. Also, if you invade any island or land space within 6 spaces of Rabaul, you'll trigger a large automatic response where the Japanese sends half of whatever there's in truck to come after you. So that's pretty exciting as well. The designer says not to expect to win easily or soon, and that was definitely my experience. You feel like you're getting somewhere, but then you look at the VP count and you've got miles to go and just 5 turns left. In a solitaire game, balance isn't something you look at really. You just want to make sure that you can't win easily, but that you can win, and this game appears to pass that test. I really enjoyed it. My only concern was I wasn't sure I was playing the air game properly. On the one hand, carriers didn't feel as decisive as I thought they ought to be, and then on the other, I felt like both sides were both constantly running out of air units. The Japanese had many unlucky rolls on refit where the units ended up eliminated rather than back in service, but the Americans also were constantly out of planes. I don't know, perhaps I was misplaying something, perhaps it's intentional. It wasn't a big deal. But once I played a few more times, maybe I'll find ways to overwhelm the Japanese with air power so some of my air units make it through. It's a pretty cool game. The rules are easy to grasp. I may question whether I was playing the air war correctly, but it's not because I found the rules ambiguous. I'll play the game for sure. This is the kind of game to travel with, perfect for when you're stuck in a hotel. This episode is also sponsored by Cube for Me. Cube for Me has quickly established themselves as the premier providers of storage solutions for historical board games. We're talking counter trays and card boxes. One of the best things about their trays is they come not just in a variety of configurations, 4 slots by 5 slots, 4 by 3, 3 by 5, whatever, but also a variety of depths. And one tray can serve as the lid for the next tray if you're looking to save space and eliminate box lid lift. Check out my website or newsletter for my link. Use it to order their trays and they'll know I sent you. They're in Poland, but I was amazed at how reasonable the shipping was. Blue versus Gray. This one is a bit of an oldie. It first came out in 1999, published by QED, in a simple pack of 2 decks of cards. Then GMT picked it up and put out a deluxe boxed version in 2003. It was designed by Evan Jones, who only has one other design to his name, also published in 1999. I think back then he talked of using the system from this game in other conflicts, but it's never happened, which is too bad because this is a fantastic game. Blue vs. Gray is a grand strategic game of the American Civil War. It's a card game right down to there being no map. Well, there is a map. As certain cards come out, you play them and build the map as you go along. The game begins with 4 map cards already out, from Toledo down to Knoxville in the west, and from Harrisburg down to south of Norfolk in the east. The game is divided. The map is divided by the mountains into a western theater and an eastern theater. Each player draws a hand of cards. The cards are leaders or units mostly. For the Union, the leaders are Army Group Commanders and Army Commanders, with the units being corps. For the Confederates, the leaders are Army Commanders or Corps Commanders, with the units being divisions. Both sides have a few cavalry units. The Union has a few naval commanders. And then both sides has a set of Enigma cards. These are cards with special abilities, generally a one-off event that they can play. Your cards have to be played in one of the 2 theaters. Each commander's cards will show how many units they can command, and in the case of the upper-level commanders, how many sub-commands that they can have under them. The leader cards are great. As you'd expect, they are actual generals, and each card has a ton of historical flavor text. Each leader is rated for initiative on the attack as well as on defense, and also has a strength value to add to any battle. And as with all games where leaders are rated, you're likely to disagree with some of the ratings. Well, I find the historical commentary on the cards leans just a tiny bit to the south. I don't see that in the ratings. For example, Grant is just a hair better than Lee, which suits me just fine. So, you get your initial hand of cards and lay a few out of each theater, with leaders only allowed to be played if they have a unit in their command. And you take a look at the map. The northern towns are Union-controlled, the south are Confederate-controlled, and Kentucky's up for grabs. The Union goes first, but the sequence of play is basically the same for both sides. First, it's the draw phase. The Union gets to draw 5 cards and or supply points. At least the first 2 have to be cards, but after that they can choose supply or another card based on what they've drawn. You can look at your cards before you decide what you're going to draw next, another card or a supply point. Supply is important as you need it to attack, and sometimes you need it to refit depleted units. Then it's deployment. The Union plays any cards from their hand into either theater. They can form new commands or strengthen existing commands. There's also rules for moving units from one theater to the other. Next, you decide if you want to attack. To do so, you pick a city adjacent to one you control and say which command you're attacking with. The defender then says which command they'll defend with. The attacker can then play a card from his hand as reserve, as can the defender, and then finally you tally up the strength points from each side. For any sort of a die roll modifier on the attack, you need to have a clear 10-point advantage. That'll get you like a +1 or a -1 if you're the defender. Then you roll the 2 dice, 1 red and 1 white. With no dice roll modifiers, it's basically a 50-50 proposition, with an edge to the side with the higher initiative rating getting the advantage 1/6 of the time, and the side with at least 5 extra strength points, but not 10 more, getting the advantage on a different 1/6 of the time. The white die tells us how heavy the casualties are. Light 50%, normal 33%, and heavy just 1 in 6. There's a little chart that shows how many casualties you take based on how many units you have in the battle, crossed with whether you won or lost. If the casualties are light, you take 1 less than the chart. If they're heavy, you take 1 extra. Also, if the total of the 2 dice is 7 or doubles, there will be a leader casualty on one side. The leader will be sacked, killed, or wounded. When a unit takes a casualty, it's depleted. Most of the units are 2 steps. There's an occasional one. Because the Union units are corps, they have much higher strengths than the rebel divisions, but the Confederates tend to have more units, so it all evens out. The wrinkle is that Confederates will take more losses, so the Union has the advantage as a single restore for them restores a whole corps, while a single restore for the Confederates only restores a division. This is balanced out by the fact that other than at the highest levels, the Union leaders are much worse than their Southern counterparts. As well, many of the Union leaders are marked as being not willing to subordinate. That means they can't be part of a larger, more powerful force. It's just them and their 2 or 3 corps. Anyway, so back to the battle. If the Union still has any supply left, they can attack again if they wish. If they made no attacks this turn, they can move on to the next step and pay a supply point to reorganize their entire army. A supply point is a precious thing, but as it takes a turn to detach a unit from one command and then next turn to attach it to a new command, it may be worth it to be able to do a bunch of those all at once. Finally, if the player has any supply left, they can spend 1 supply to restore up to 3 units. Units, as I said, are generally 2-step. If they lose both steps, the Union goes to the cadre pile where they can be restored for 2 steps of supply. Then it's over to the Confederate player. They generally get a 4-card draw. However, they get a free supply point unless the Union has got some naval leaders out forming a blockade. On the downside, if the Union controls certain cities, Confederate production contracts and the draw is reduced to 3 cards. But whatever their draw, their turn sequence is identical to the Union, and so back and forth it goes. Each player has map cards in their deck for all the empty map spaces. The cards are not identical for the 2 sides. The Confederate map cards slightly favor the South and vice versa. So it's an advantage to get your map cards out before the other player, whose cards will then become invalid. Victory for the Union occurs if they can manage to grab enough VP locations before either side runs out of cards. From that description, you can see it's a bit of a sandbox. The battles aren't going to happen in the same order they did historically, and the leaders are certainly not likely to be associated with the same battles they fought in real life. But if that doesn't ruffle your feathers, it's a fantastic game. In the early game, the agony of the card draws is you either have too few leaders or too few units is totally exquisite. The way an important leader can be killed, sacked, or wounded at precisely the long time is exciting, if totally frustrating. And most of all, it feels like the Civil War. In the East, it's slow going for the Union, as many of the cities are rated as pest holes, which give the rebels an extra 5 strength points, or forts, which give the defender a -1 dice roll modifier on the combat roll. Whereas in the West, the Union is likely to barrel on down the Mississippi, but will they have time to swing through Atlanta and back up the East Coast? Who knows? There's a bunch of smaller chrome rules. Cavalry can be used to raid unused supply from your opponent. Each corps or division is listed as East or West and has to be initially placed in the correct theater. There's rules for keeping supply lines intact and for the effective control of the rivers. The Union can attempt to evade by sea. There's also a dozen optional rules where the designer rates each one as pro-north or south, so you can use any of these to help balance the game if you think it needs it. I don't think the game is in print at GMT anymore, which is a real shame. If you can find one on the secondary market, I recommend it. It can also be played via Vassal with a small tweak to the endgame just to make Vassal deal with it. I've played several games that way, and I'm playing one that way now. It's no problem at all. It's pretty straightforward. Anyway, I totally recommend the game. Check it out. Blue versus Gray. Verdun. Verdun, just Verdun, no subheading. It's from Dragon Dawn, a small Finnish publisher that's new to me, but apparently they've been around close to 20 years. This may be their first war game, or let's say actually war game adjacent. I backed this Kickstarter as it looked to me to be a medium-light card game on Verdun. As it turns out, it has very little to do with Verdun in particular. It does have a World War I skin, but it could work for all sorts of battles. That is to say, it works as a game. As a simulation, to my mind, almost not at all, other than the one clever thing that I'll get to at the end. The game is all cards with a handful of markers for each side. There's a board, but it's not really needed. The game plays best at 2 versus 2, but there's also rules for 1 versus 1. Each side has 5 asset cards that they place face down on their side of the board. And each of these cards will have a varying number of stars on it, representing the worth of the asset and victory points at the end. The board just holds a space for my 5 cards directly across from your 5 cards, so this is a very small board. Each side also has 6 little blocks with the numbers between 0 and 7 on each one, representing fortifications. Each player randomly gets rid of one block and then assigns each of the remaining 5 to their 5 cards, so these fortifications will protect the asset that is underneath them. And then there's the main deck of cards, the troop deck. It's a trick-taking game, sort of, so there's 2 suits, French and German. The cards run from 2 to 13 in each suit, plus there's a few specialty cards. Each of the cards has a number of skulls on the bottom, between 1 and 5. The higher the value of the card, the more skulls. These will count as negative victory points at the end. And then there's also a small separate deck of tactical cards the players will draw from. I'll describe the 4-player version, but 2-player is similar. In 2 versus 2, teammates don't sit beside each other, but rather across from one another, so on the 4 corners. So as the play goes around the table, it will alternate between France and Germany. It also means the teammates can't see each other's cards, so much more difficult to coordinate. The big deck is shuffled and 16 cards are dealt to each player. There's also a shorter version where some of the cards are removed from the deck and the hand size is only 12 cards. The first player decides which of the opponent's 5 fortifications they're going to attack and plays a card. Their hand will be made up of cards from both sides, so right away you can see there's going to be decisions. After that card is played, play passes clockwise around the table until we have 4 cards played. We count up all the French amounts and all the German amounts of the pips of the cards to see who's ahead. Given that sometimes you'll have to play cards from your opponent's suit, you'll sometimes be helping them rather than yourself. So it's a game of balancing, trying to do well with your own suits and trying to get rid of cards that would be helpful to your opponent. Anyway, back to the hand. Let's say the German players were the first player, attacking a French fortification. The 4 cards are played, and it turns out the defender, the French, outscores the attacker. Nothing happens to the fortification or asset. But if it turned out that the attacker outscores the defender then reveals the value of the fortification marker and adds that to the defender's total. If the attacker no longer outscores the defender, the fort remains revealed, but the asset card stays protected. And then finally, if after adding the fort value in, the attacker still outscores the defender, the fort is discarded and the attacker gets the asset card. You turn it face up, you see how many stars you've just won, and that asset card goes in your scoring pile. But there's still a couple of twists. One side will have won the battle, unless all cards were the same suit, in which case no battle occurs. From the side that won, they put the lower value of their 2 played cards on their score pile, and the loser puts the higher value of their 2 cards on their score pile. That means the winner will be usually putting less of those skull symbols in their pile than the loser. After that, both sides will still have 1 card on the table. Whoever has the higher remaining card gets to draw a tactics card into their hand. And that's a round played. Then the next player becomes the attacker and the process is repeated. The tactics cards can be played alongside your regular troop card play. They make small changes. Maybe add a few pips to your score. Maybe they make it so that both of each teams go to the scoring pile rather than just one each and the other ones go to discard. You play until there's no cards left, and that's a game. Or you can agree to play 2 or 3 hands rather than just a single hand. Anyway, however many hands you played, when you're done, it's time to count the points. Your scoring pile is also called your casualty pile. That's where all those skull points ended up. It's going to end up with way more troop cards with the little skulls than asset cards with the stars. Each player adds up their stars and then subtracts their skulls. The higher total is the winner. So I'll note that the scores will be very negative. In a one-deck game, a typical score might be minus 35 to minus 45, in which case the minus 35 players would win the game. And this is where we get a bit more of the theme. In order to win tricks, you need to play large cards, and that means more skulls into the casualty piles. We start to see echoes of the men fed into the World War I trench warfare machine. More and more men needed to try and harder to win the battles. And then in the end, it's no accident that skulls, the value of the lives lost, greatly outweighs the stars, the assets won. In its own way, this game is making a statement about war. All that said, nothing about playing the game feels remotely like anything to do with the Battle of Verdun or any World War I battle. Yes, you are adding men to the battle each time you play a card, but that's about it. This could easily be played with no World War I skin whatsoever, and you'd have the same game. So I don't think it's going to be a big draw with the grognards. I mean, it's not a bad game otherwise, but I don't see it playing. I don't see myself playing it much. It's not something I'd play with my war game friends, and it's probably not something my family would enjoy. For what's essentially not a war game, but just a card game, it still has a pretty bleak message. Parting shots. I'd like to give a shout out to David Heath of Lock and Load and Richard Handwith and Roger Miller of Revolution for being part of the roundtable on tariffs. I asked a lot of publishers. Many said they'd be happy to come talk to me about something else, but didn't want to talk about the tariffs. A couple said they were still working on the responses, so they weren't ready to discuss things. And one said that since it was after office hours, they wouldn't be participating. I don't know what to make of that. When else would you have a roundtable? Anyway, thanks to the two companies who showed up and let people know what their thinking was and what their plans are. They're very different companies with very different business models, so it was great to get a contrast. I really appreciated their participation. And also thanks to everyone who showed up live and made comments or asked questions. The comment box was mostly free of politics and more focused on what's happening and what to do about it, so I thank you all. Okay, thanks as always to all the Pushing Cardboard supporters, whether it's by becoming a Ko-Fi patron or buying swag. It helps pay all those hosting and streaming bills. And thanks as well to everyone who takes the time to stop by the website or the Discord channel. It's all very appreciated. If you'd like to receive the newsletter and you're not, you can sign up at the website. There's one newsletter just for the podcast, which contains links to some of the things discussed in each episode, and another newsletter if you want to be notified of any special events. That one gets used much less often, but I recommend it. And there may be a third coming. I might come up with one just to remind folks every 2 weeks about the live stream. We'll see about that. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for listening, and until next time, enjoy the Stanley Cup playoffs.